Welcome back, explorers, to Whoosh Tales, the home of the greatest kids' adventure stories anywhere on the internet, bringing you a brand new English story for children every single week. This is episode 20, and if you watched last week, you will remember exactly where we left Finn, Caleb, and Nora, drifting in a small harbor launch off the coast of a Welsh fishing village, watching the enormous dark shape of the sleeping giant rise and fall gently on the tide ahead of them, with Bronwyn Price at the wheel and a boy beside her about to attempt something the family had never quite attempted before. Not the healing of a tired ancient creature, not the comforting of something that had been alone in the dark for 3,000 years, calling faintly for help. Something different, something that had been asleep for far longer than any of the chambers on the map, and had woken up by accident, and did not yet understand its own new wakefulness at all. Bronwyn brought the launch in slowly, cutting the engine well back and letting the small boat drift the last stretch on the gentle push of the tide, the way a careful sailor approaches something she does not fully understand but respects completely. The sleeping giant rose up ahead of them, closer now than it had been from the air or from the harbor mouth, and up close its resemblance to an actual sleeping figure was almost startling. The great curved shoulder catching the late golden light, the bowed shape where a head might rest, deep crevices running down what could have been a spine, all of it slick with sea spray and hung with long, dark ribbons of kelp that moved gently with the swell like a blanket breathing slowly up and down. Caleb sat very still at the bow, watching it, his face calm and completely focused. Finn sat close beside him, and Nora sat just behind them both, her hand resting lightly on the gunwale, watching everything with the careful protective attention she brought to every important moment her brothers faced. Bronwyn held the boat steady with small, careful adjustments of the tiller, saying nothing, waiting. "We are close enough," Caleb said quietly after a long moment. "Could you hold us here?" Bronwyn nodded and cut the little engine down to the barest idle, just enough to hold their position against the gentle pull of the current. The boat rocked softly. The rock rose directly in front of them now, close enough that Finn could hear the small individual sounds of the water moving in and out of its crevices, close enough to smell the deep mineral salt smell of very old wet stone mixed with the green living smell of the kelp draped across it. Caleb reached forward slowly and pressed his open palm flat against the wet stone. Nothing happened immediately. He held his hand there, very still, his eyes closed, his breathing slow and even. Finn watched his brother's face carefully, the way he always did in these moments, and saw the small subtle shift that meant Caleb was listening, not with his ears, but with a deeper sense that let him feel the warmth or absence of warmth in living things, the presence or exhaustion of whatever lay beneath the chamber floor, or a dying stem, or now, an enormous stretch of ancient wet rock. After perhaps a minute, Caleb's eyes opened slowly. He did not remove his hand. "Hello," he said softly to the rock. His voice was gentle in a way Finn had heard him use before with frightened or uncertain things. The small plum tree in Kalimpong, the exhausted creature in the Arabian Sea chamber. "You do not need to be afraid of us," Caleb said quietly. "We are not here to hurt you. We only came because some friends of ours were worried about their boats, and I think you have been worried too, about what you are allowed to do now that you are awake again." The boat rocked gently. Bronwyn watched with wide, careful eyes, her hand steady on the tiller. Nora had gone very still. Finn held his breath slightly, without quite meaning to, and then, very slowly, very subtly, in a way that none of them could have precisely described afterward, but all of them agreed they had genuinely felt, something in the rock shifted, not physically. Nothing moved, but the quality of the water around them changed, the way the air in a room changes when someone who has been holding their breath finally, carefully, lets it out. A very faint, very old, very patient sense of attention turned toward them. Caleb's breath caught slightly. He kept his hand steady on the stone. "There you are," he said softly, almost to himself. "Hello, I am Caleb." He paused, listening. "It is all right," he said, even more gently than before. "You did not hurt anyone. You were just testing whether you still could feel the world around you, weren't you? After such a long, long sleep, you were not sure any of your old feelings still worked. So you reached out very carefully toward the first thing that came close enough to touch. And you've been doing it every time since, because each time you needed to check again to be sure it was not an accident, to be sure you really were awake and really could still feel something. The boat rocked again gently in the quiet. Caleb was quiet himself for a long moment, listening with his whole still body. Then he said very softly, Oh, I see. He turned his head slightly toward Finn, though he did not take his hand from the stone. He says he has been asleep since before this harbor existed. Caleb said quietly, since before the people who first lived in this valley built their first boats. He says he was a guardian once. Not a chamber, not a hidden creature, but of this whole stretch of coast, of the currents and the tides and the safe passage of anyone who sailed near him. He says that a very long time ago, when the old ways of honoring the sea began to be forgotten, he simply grew tired and settled into a long, deep sleep, the way old things sometimes do when nobody remembers to ask anything of them anymore. He did not mean to sleep for so long. He simply never had a reason to wake. Caleb paused, listening again. Then the storm came. He continued softly. 6 months ago. It moved a great deal of stone and sediment around his base, the kind of disturbance that has not happened to him in centuries, and it woke him, suddenly, without warning. And he found himself awake in a world that has changed enormously since he fell asleep, surrounded by boats that move without oars or sails, following rules of sea he does not recognize, filled with people who no longer know his name or his old purpose. Very carefully, the way you might reach out and touch something in the dark to find out if it is real, and every time he found that, yes, he could still feel, he could still reach, he was still here. And then, frightened by his own uncertainty, he would let go again, and the boat would simply continue on its way. Bronwyn, who had been listening to all of this with an expression of quiet, growing wonder, said softly, he was not trying to stop the boats at all. No, Caleb said gently. He was trying to remember how to exist. Every single time. He had been terrified that this time he would reach out and find nothing there, that the world truly had moved on without him, that his old purpose was entirely gone, that there was no place for him anymore. And every single time, when a boat's engine stopped and then simply started again, he was checking, making sure he had not imagined it, making sure he was really still capable of touching the world at all. Finn felt something tighten gently in his chest, listening to this. He thought of Caleb himself in the small warm room inside Graymore Mountain, reading the same books over and over for 11 years, wondering what the sun actually felt like, wondering if he would ever truly be allowed to step outside and be part of the world he had only ever read about. He understood, watching his brother's hand resting gently against the ancient wet stone, that Caleb recognized something of himself in the sleeping giant's long, uncertain waking. That this was perhaps exactly why the compass, no, not even the compass, simply Caleb's own presence in the world, simply the fact of him existing and traveling and being seen, had been the very thing needed here. Not healing, not a gift of light poured into failing reserves. Simply recognition. Simply someone saying, gently and clearly, yes, you're still here, and yes, there's still a place for you. Caleb kept his hand on the stone for a long time after that, saying very little, simply being present, the way he had learned to be present with the small curled creatures in the chambers, the way he had learned from Anya, that the deepest work an old one does is very often not dramatic at all, but simply the quiet act of staying, of witnessing, of letting something ancient and uncertain know that it has been truly seen, and is not, after everything, entirely alone. The boat rocked gently on the golden afternoon swell. The gulls wheeled overhead. Bronwyn held the tiller steady, and did not say a single word, understanding without being told that this moment needed nothing from her except her stillness. After a long while, Caleb spoke again, quietly. I have told him something. He said, looking at Bronwyn now, I have told him that the world still needs guardians of the coast, even if the old ceremonies people used to perform for him have been forgotten. I have told him that the boats which pass him every day are still full of people whose safety matters just as much as it ever did, and that he can still watch over them, exactly the way he used to, if he wants to. He does not need anyone to remember his old name, or his old rituals for his old purpose to still be real and still be needed. He can simply choose to take it back up quietly, in his own way, without anyone even needing to know he is doing it. He paused, listening once more. And I have told him, Caleb added gently, that he does not need to test whether he is still real by stopping every boat that passes. He can simply trust that he is, and let them go by undisturbed. the way a guardian who is confident in his own purpose does not need to prove it over and over. He understands now, I think. He is not going to stop the boats anymore. He was never trying to be a danger. He was only ever trying to be sure he still existed. Caleb finally drew his hand back from the stone. He looked tired in a particular quiet way that came after this kind of deep listening work, though not drained the way he had been after the Arabian Sea Chamber. This had asked something gentler of him, something closer to companionship than to healing. He turned to Bronwyn. "I think," he said, "that from tomorrow the boats will pass safely. I do not think it will happen again. But I think it might be a kind thing if the harbor ever wanted to leave a small offering near the rock now and then. Nothing elaborate, just something simple, the way people used to, so that he continues to feel remembered rather than forgotten again. Flowers thrown from a boat. A moment of quiet acknowledgement as vessels pass. Small things. He does not need much. He only ever needed to be noticed." Bronwyn was quiet for a long moment, looking at the great dark shape of the rock, her weathered face move in a way she did not try to hide. "I think," she said finally, "we can absolutely manage that." She looked at Caleb with an expression of complete, grateful astonishment. "I have lived beside that rock my entire life," she said softly. "I never once thought to wonder if it might be lonely." They motored slowly back toward the harbor in the deepening gold of the late afternoon, the sleeping giant receding gently behind them, its great dark shape settling back into what looked now like a genuinely peaceful rest rather than an uncertain waiting. Nora put her arm around Caleb's shoulders as they went, and Caleb leaned into her gratefully, quiet and thoughtful, the particular thoughtful quiet of a boy who had just done something important and gentle and was still settling back into himself after it. That evening the whole village seemed to know already, word traveling, as word does in small harbor communities, faster than any of them could quite account for. Fishermen stopped Bronwyn on the quayside to ask, cautiously, hopefully, whether it was true, whether the strange trouble at the sleeping giant had really been sorted, and Bronwyn told each of them the same careful, honest version of the truth, that a family of quite extraordinary children had come a very long way to help, and that she believed with her whole heart that the harbor would be safe again from tomorrow. Several of the older fishermen nodded slowly at this, in the manner of people who had grown up hearing their own grandparents speak, half jokingly, half seriously, of the old stories about the rock, and who found themselves, on this particular evening, taking those old half-forgotten stories rather more seriously than they ever had before. That night, at the small harbor bed and breakfast, Bronwyn's elderly mother cooked them an enormous supper of fresh-caught fish and thick brown bread, and a particular kind of Welsh cake that Nora declared, after a third one, to be quite possibly the finest thing she had ever eaten, and asked for the recipe so earnestly that Bronwyn's mother promised to write it out for her before they left in the morning. Caleb was quiet through supper, in the good, tired way, and went to bed early, and Finn found him a little later sitting at the small window again, looking out at the dark harbor and the faint, darker shape of the rock beyond it. "Do you think he will be all right now?" Finn asked quietly, settling beside him. Caleb was quiet for a moment, thinking. "I think so," he said finally. "I think the hardest part of being forgotten is not the silence. It is the fear that the silence means you no longer matter at all. Once you know that is not true, once someone has actually come and told you, clearly, that you are still needed, the rest becomes much easier to bear." He looked at Finn. "I think that is true for almost everyone, not just for enormous ancient sleeping rocks." He smiled slightly. "I think it might even be true for elderly people who live alone, or for kids at school who nobody talks to, or for anyone, really, who has quietly started to wonder whether they still matter to the world around them." Finn thought about this for a long moment, looking out at the dark harbor with his brother. "That is a very big thought for the end of a long day," he said eventually. Caleb laughed softly. "Yes," he agreed, "it probably is. But I think it is the whole point of today." Finn nodded slowly. Then he pulled the curtain closed gently, and the two boys climbed into their beds, and outside in the dark Welsh night, off the harbor mouth, an ancient patient guardian who had finally been properly seen settled into his first truly peaceful rest in 6 months, no longer needing to reach out and check, simply trusting, at last, that he was still real and still remembered and still, in his own quiet way, needed, and that the lesson at the heart of this kid's adventure story for explorers is one of the gentlest and most important lessons this whole series has offered. Sometimes the people or creatures or things around you that seem to be causing trouble are not actually trying to cause trouble at all. Sometimes they are simply frightened. Sometimes they are testing over and over whether they still matter, whether anyone would notice if they disappeared, whether the world still has a place for them at all. When you meet someone who is behaving in a confusing or difficult way, before you decide they are simply being difficult, ask yourself gently whether they might actually just be afraid, whether they might be quietly checking, the only way they know how, whether they are still seen. And if you can find a way to tell them clearly and kindly that yes, they're still seen, yes, they still matter, yes, there is still a place for them, you may find, the way Caleb found today, that the trouble simply settles quietly and completely, all on its own. Being truly seen is one of the deepest needs any living thing has. Learn to offer it generously. It costs you almost nothing, and it can change absolutely everything for the person or the creature or the ancient sleeping rock on the other end of it. Hey, explorers! If you sat in that small harbor launch with Finn, Caleb, and Nora today and watched Caleb gently help an ancient guardian remember that he still mattered, give this video the biggest thumbs up it has ever received because you have absolutely earned every tender moment of it. Our comment question today is a truly lovely one. Have you ever had to be patient and gentle with someone who was scared of their own new feelings or their own new powers, or simply scared of not matching anymore? What did you do to help them? Tell us about it in the comments below. Every single response will be read with real care. Subscribe to Whoosh Tales right now and ring that notification bell so you never miss a single adventure story for kids. Because next week, back home in Stonehaven, Nora receives a letter of her own for the very first time. Not for Finn, not for Caleb, but addressed specifically to her. And what it asks of her is unlike anything the family has faced so far. We will see you next week, explorers. Hush! They flew home the following morning after a long, warm goodbye on the quayside, Bronwyn's whole family and half the village. It seemed, gathered to see them off, small children waving, an elderly fisherman pressing a carved wooden model of a fishing boat into Finn's hands as a gift, Bronwyn herself hugging each of them in turn and making them promise, quite seriously, to come back one day just a visit, not for any work, simply to see how the harbor was getting on. Ember lifted them off in the quiet field above the village into a bright, clear Pembrokeshire morning, and as they climbed and banked north toward home, Finn looked back once and saw, far below, the great dark shape of the sleeping giant resting peacefully in the calm morning water, entirely undisturbed, entirely at ease, exactly the way a guardian who knows his purpose is still needed ought to rest. He smiled and turned forward and let Ember carry them home.